Widow with 3 sons was rejected. The cowboy said, "You're home now." The wind across the plains spoke a language of its own, a desolate dialect of dust and distance. It was a sound Silas Blackwood understood better than the words of men. It scoured the land, bent the stubborn grasses, and scraped away anything that wasn't rooted deep. He felt a kinship with it. For 5 years, it had been his only constant companion, its lonely howl a fitting chorus to the silence he had built around his life like a stone wall. He was mending a fence at the far edge of his property, his movements methodical, economical. Each twist of wire, each tap of the hammer was a familiar rhythm against the emptiness. It was work that required his hands but left his mind free to drift in the gray expanse of memory, a place he tried to avoid but always found himself returning to. That's when he saw them, a smudge of movement on the horizon, slowly resolving into 4 figures against the endless brown. A woman and 3 boys walking. No wagon, no horse. Just the 4 of them, trudging along the dusty track that passed for a road. Their shoulders slumped with a weariness that the land itself seemed to press down upon them. He stopped his work, hammer held loose in his hand, and watched. People were a rarity out here. A threat. Complication. His first instinct was to turn his back, to retreat into the shell of his solitude and let them pass. Another piece of driftwood on the current of a harsh world. He had nothing to offer them. He had nothing left to offer anyone. But they did not pass. They stopped at his fence line, 100 yards away. The woman stood for a long moment, staring at the thin curl of smoke rising from his cabin's chimney. It was a beacon of life in a vast, indifferent landscape. He could see the hesitation in her posture, the debate she was having with a pride that had likely been stripped bare long ago. The 3 boys huddled close to her, small satellites drawn to her fading gravity. The eldest stood straight, trying to be a man, his small face a mask of fierce protection. The other 2 were just children, their heads bowed against the relentless wind. Finally, she took a breath he couldn't see but could feel across the distance, and started towards him, her steps unsteady on the broken ground. The boys followed, a ragged little flock. As she drew closer, he saw the full measure of her exhaustion. Her face was smudged with dirt and streaked with the salt of tears or sweat. He couldn't tell which. Her dress was worn thin, the hem frayed and caked with dust. But it was her eyes that held him. They were filled with a desperate, hunted look, the look of a creature that has run as far as it can. Yet, beneath the fear, there was a core of resilience, a quiet dignity that had refused to be extinguished. She stopped a few feet from him, clutching a thin shawl around her shoulders. The boys hid behind her skirts, peeking out at the tall, silent man. "Please," she said, her voice a dry rasp, barely audible above the wind. "Just some water. For my sons." Silas didn't answer. He looked from her face to the 3 small, dusty faces behind her. He saw their chapped lips, their hollow eyes. He saw his own failure reflected in their need. The ghosts of his past rose up, whispering accusations he'd heard every day for 5 years. "You did nothing then. You do nothing now." The hammer felt heavy in his hand. The world had enough cruelty. He didn't need to add to it. But kindness was a currency he had long since stopped trading in. Felt foreign, dangerous. He looked at the smallest boy, who couldn't be more than 4. The child stared back at him with wide, solemn eyes, unafraid. In that gaze, something in Silas cracked. A fissure in the stone wall he had so carefully constructed. He gave a single, curt nod. He turned without a word and walked back toward his cabin, not looking to see if she followed. He heard the crunch of her worn boots on the dry earth behind him, the soft scuffling of the boy's smaller feet. The sound was an intrusion, a violation of the profound silence he had cultivated. He walked past the well, gesturing to it with his hammer. Then he continued on to the barn, its great gray doors weathered and scarred. He slid one open with a groan of old wood. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of hay and dust and animals long gone. He pointed into the dim interior. "Tonight," he said, It was the only word he offered. An explanation, an invitation, a boundary. She hesitated at the threshold, peering into the gloom. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes again, the calculation of risk. This strange, silent man, this isolated place. But then she looked down at her sons, at their drooping heads and dirt-caked legs. Her choice was not for herself. It never was. She straightened her shoulders and herded her boys inside. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty air as he turned and walked away. The barn door slid shut, leaving them in the dusty twilight. A change had come. The wind no longer sounded so empty. Inside the barn, Elara leaned against the rough-hewn wall, her body finally surrendering to the tremors of exhaustion. The heavy door thudded shut, plunging them into a semi-darkness striped with thin lines of afternoon sun slanting through the cracks in the siding. The air was thick with the scent of old hay, leather, and dry earth. It was a safe smell, a smell of shelter. For the first time in days, she felt she could breathe without tasting fear. Her sons, Caleb, Finn, and Leo, stood close, their small bodies pressed against her legs. Caleb, at 10, was trying his best to be brave, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the shadowy corners of the vast space. Finn, who was 7, just looked tired, his thumb finding its way to his mouth. And little Leo, only 4, began to cry softly, a whimper of pure, undiluted weariness. "Sure, Leo," Elara soothed, stroking his hair. "We're safe now. We can rest." She led them to a pile of clean straw in an empty stall, the driest, most protected corner she could find. They sank into it, the boys curling into her like puppies seeking warmth. She held them, her own hunger and thirst a dull ache compared to the sharp relief of being still, of being out of the relentless sun and wind. She listened. The only sounds were the sighing of the wind around the barn's eaves and the thumping of her own heart. The man had said nothing. He had simply opened a door. Could be a kindness or it could be a trap. Her life had taught her to suspect the latter. Men who offered help often wanted payment she was not willing to give. A short while later, the heavy door scraped open again. Elara sat bolt upright, pulling her sons behind her. The man stood silhouetted against the bright afternoon light. He carried a wooden pail in one hand and something bundled in cloth in the other. He walked a few paces inside, set the items on the dirt floor well away from them, and then retreated without a word, pulling the door almost shut but leaving a gap for light and air. Cautiously, Elara approached. The pail was full of cool, clean water from the well. She could have wept at the sight of it. She drank first deeply, then gave it to Caleb, who helped his younger brothers. The water was life itself, washing the dust from their throats and the despair from their hearts. The bundle contained a small, dark loaf of bread, still faintly warm, a wedge of hard cheese, and 3 woolen blankets. The blankets were worn, patched in several places, but they were clean and smelled of cedar. It was a simple offering, given without expectation or conversation. This was a language she understood better than false smiles and promises. It was the language of survival. It was enough. They ate the bread and cheese, sharing it meticulously, each bite a sacrament. Then, as the light faded outside, she wrapped her sons in the blankets. They were asleep in minutes, their small bodies finally at peace. Elara, however, stayed awake long into the night, listening. She watched the sliver of moonlight that crept through the door, her hand resting on Caleb's chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. In a corner, high on a crossbeam, she saw the dark shape of something small. A carved bird, its wings half spread as if in mid-flight. It was a delicate, useless thing in this place of harsh utility. It spoke of a time before silence had taken over this farm, a time of softer hands and gentler voices. It made her wonder about the man who lived here now, the man who had built a wall around himself but had left a small gate unlocked. The days that followed fell into a silent, unspoken routine. Silas would rise in the dark, the chill of the cabin floor a familiar shock. He would do his chores, milking his lone cow, feeding the chickens, checking the fences, with the same grim efficiency he applied to everything. But now there was a new task. He would leave a pail of fresh milk, a few eggs, and a portion of whatever he'd cooked for himself on a flat stone near the barn door. He never knocked. He never lingered. He would deposit the offering and retreat to the far fields, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the family he had reluctantly sheltered. He told himself it was temporary. They would rest, regain their strength, and move on. He was merely providing a brief respite, a small act to quiet the ghosts that haunted him. He did not want to know their names. He did not want to hear their story. Stories were anchors, and he had learned the hard way that anchors could drown a man. Yet he found himself watching. From the rise of the west pasture, he could see the barn. He saw the woman, whose name he still did not know, washing their few clothes in a bucket and hanging them to dry on a low branch of the cottonwood tree. He saw the boys, their energy slowly returning, playing quiet games in the patch of sunlight by the door. They were careful not to stray, to make noise, to exist too loudly. They understood, with the innate wisdom of vulnerable creatures, that their presence here was tenuous. Elara, for her part, accepted the daily provisions with a quiet gratitude that she had no way to express. She was a woman accustomed to work, and the idleness chafed at her. She looked for ways to repay the man's silent charity. One afternoon, while he was gone, she saw one of his work shirts hanging on a line, a long tear under the arm. She took it down and, using the small sewing kit she carried in her pocket, one of the few possessions she had left, she mended it with neat, precise stitches. She hung it back where she found it. The next morning the shirt was gone. He had not acknowledged the gesture, but she knew he had seen it. Another day, she took the worn broom from beside the cabin door and swept the packed earth of the barn floor until it was clean. She organized the scattered tools, hanging them on their proper hooks. She was making a space for them, but also erasing the signs of their intrusion, trying to be as unobtrusive as a shadow. She instructed her sons sternly. "You do not go near the house. You do not touch his things. You do not bother the man." The boys obeyed mostly, but their childish curiosity was a force of nature. Finn and Leo were fascinated by the chickens, and would spend hours watching them peck and scratch in the dirt. Caleb, older and more somber, watched the man. He saw the way Silas moved, the sureness in his hands as he repaired a harness or sharpened an axe. He saw the deep loneliness in the man's posture when he stood on the porch at dusk, staring out at the setting sun. One afternoon, Silas was in his workshop, a small lean-to attached to the barn, sharpening a blade on his whetstone. He was so absorbed in the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone that he didn't hear the small footsteps behind him. "Is that your little boy?" Silas froze, his hand stopping mid-stroke. He turned slowly. It was the smallest one, Leo. The child was pointing to the high shelf above the workbench. There sat a small, dusty rocking horse, its paint faded and chipped, one of its leather ears missing. It was another relic from the time before, something he had been unable to bring himself to burn but could not bear to look at. Silas stared at the boy, his throat tight. The child's innocent question had struck him like a physical blow. He saw another boy's face, laughing as he rocked on that very horse. The memory was so sharp, so painful, it stole the air from his lungs. He felt a familiar cold dread wash over him. He had known this was a mistake. Letting them stay, letting life, however small, creep back into the cracks of his fortress. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He simply stood up, his face a granite mask, and walked out of the workshop, leaving the boy standing alone with the ghost in the room. He went to the far pasture and did not return until long after dark. When he did, the rocking horse was gone from the shelf. He didn't know if the woman had seen it and moved it, or if he had imagined the whole encounter. He only knew that the silence now felt heavier, freighted with questions he could not answer and a past he could not escape. He looked at his hands, calloused and empty. He saw the faces of his wife and son, clear as day, then the faces of the woman and her 3 boys. He felt a muscle jump in his jaw. The wall was cracking. The days shortened, and a chill began to lace the edges of the wind. Silas found a new rhythm, one that grudgingly included the family in the barn. He no longer felt the constant urge to flee to the fields. He worked closer to the homestead, his tasks keeping him within sight of the woman and her sons. He watched them from a distance, a silent, solitary guardian. He noticed the way Ilara's shoulders were less hunched, the way her son's laughter, though still quiet, was becoming more frequent. He was a man who noticed details. It was how he survived. He noticed the sole of Ilara's right shoe was flapping loose, a constant trip hazard. He knew she had nothing to fix it with. The next morning, next to the pail of milk, he left a small pot of foul-smelling leather glue, a curved needle, and a length of waxed thread. He was gone before the sun crested the horizon, already working on the northern fence line, his back to the barn. When he returned that evening, the pot and tools were gone from the stone. Later, through the open door of his cabin, he saw her sitting on the barn step, her shoe in her lap, working carefully by the fading light. She did not look up, but he felt her awareness of him, a silent acknowledgement that passed between them on the cool evening air. He also saw the way her boys played. They had no toys, save for the sticks and stones the prairie offered. Their games were imaginative but subdued. He remembered his own son, a whirlwind of energy, who had never been still. The memory was a dull ache, a phantom limb. He found an old, scarred block of cedar wood, its grain straight and true. He took his whittling knife, its blade worn smooth with use, and left them both on a large tree stump that served as a chopping block near the barn. He offered no instruction, no explanation. It was just an object, left for the taking. For 2 days, the block of wood and the knife sat untouched. He thought perhaps she had forbidden it, that she feared the sharp blade in the hands of a boy. But on the third afternoon he saw Caleb, the eldest, sitting on the stump, the wood in one hand, the knife in the other. He was clumsy at first, his cuts shallow and hesitant. But he was patient. He worked for hours, shavings piling up around his feet. The younger boys watched, captivated. Silas observed from the shade of the porch, pretending to mend a piece of tack. He saw the boy's intense concentration, the way his brow furrowed as he tried to coax a shape from the wood. It was the same look of concentration Silas saw in the mirror each morning. The following day, the knife was back on his porch rail, wiped clean and laid carefully on a rag. Beside it was the block of wood. It was no longer a block. It had 4 legs, a crude head, and a notched tail. It was unmistakably a horse. It was rough, asymmetrical, and beautiful. Silas picked it up. The wood was still warm from the boy's hands. He ran a thumb over the uneven surface. It was a message. Thank you. An attempt to build a bridge across the chasm of silence that separated them. He took the wooden horse inside and set it on the mantelpiece of his stone fireplace, next to nothing at all. It looked small and lonely, but it was a start. One afternoon, a lone rider appeared on the road, a rare event that always set Silas on edge. It was just a traveler, passing through. But as the horse and rider drew near his property, he saw a sudden, sharp movement from the barn. Ilara, who had been outside shaking a blanket, snatched it up and practically threw her sons back into the shadows of the barn. She flattened herself against the interior wall, her body rigid, her face a pale mask of terror. It was not caution. It was a primal, instinctual fear. Silas stood perfectly still in the field, 100 yards away, watching. The rider passed by without a second glance, oblivious. But the image of Ilara's panic was burned into Silas's mind. It told him a piece of her story she would never have spoken aloud. It told him she wasn't just poor and unlucky. She was running from something, or someone. The knowledge settled in his gut like a cold stone. His solitude had been a shield against his own pain. He was beginning to realize it might now have to be a shield for hers, too. The sky had been a bruised purple for days, the air heavy and still with a strange electric tension. Silas knew the signs. He could read the sky better than he could read a book. A blue norther was coming. A sudden, violent plunge in temperature that could freeze a man where he stood if he wasn't prepared. He spent the day reinforcing the barn doors, checking the seals on his cabin windows, and bringing in enough firewood to last a week. He moved with a quiet urgency. He tried to warn Alara, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain the unique and deadly fury of a prairie storm to a woman who was already so full of fear? He settled for action. He left a larger portion of food than usual by the barn door, a whole smoked ham, a sack of potatoes, and a full jug of milk. He also left his own heavy sheepskin coat, the one he saved for the worst of winter. He laid it folded on the stone, a silent, desperate plea for her to understand the danger. The storm hit just after sundown. It did not arrive gently. It was a physical blow, a wall of wind and ice that slammed into the plains. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in as many minutes. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at the roof of the cabin, rattling the windows in their frames. Sleet, hard as pebbles, hammered against the glass. Silas sat by his fire, listening. The hearth was the only point of warmth and light in a world that had descended into a roaring, frozen darkness. He thought of the family in the barn. The barn was sturdy, he had built it himself. But it was not tight. The wind would find every crack, every seam. The cold would be a physical presence, a thief stealing the warmth from their bodies. He stoked the fire, his knuckles white. He told himself they would be fine. They had blankets. They had each other. He had done what he could. It was not his responsibility. Then, through a lull in the wind, he heard it. A sound that cut through the storm's fury and pierced his heart. It was the thin, high wail of a child in distress. It was a sound he had not heard in 5 years, but one he would never forget. It was the sound of a feverish, painful cry. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floorboards. He paced the small cabin, a caged animal. Every instinct screamed at him to stay put, to guard his solitude, to not get involved. Involvement led to pain. Involvement led to loss. He had learned that lesson in the most brutal way possible. He walked to the window and wiped the condensation from the pane. He could see nothing but a swirling vortex of black and white. The crying continued, weaker now, almost lost in the gale. He saw his own son, his small body burning with fever, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He saw his wife's frantic, pleading eyes. He saw his own helplessness as he'd watched the life fade from them both, trapped by a blizzard much like this one. You did nothing then. The ghosts were screaming now, their voices louder than the wind. You will do nothing now. With a choked cry, Silas turned from the window. He grabbed his lantern from the hook by the door, his hands shaking as he lit the wick. He pulled on his boots, snatched a spare blanket from his bed, and plunged out into the storm. The wind hit him like a fist, stealing his breath and driving the icy sleet into his face. He lowered his head and pushed forward, the lantern swinging wildly, casting a small, dancing circle of light on the maelstrom around him. The 30 yards to the barn felt like a mile. He fought for every step, the wind trying to push him back. When he finally reached the doors, he had to use his shoulder to force them open against the gale. He stumbled inside, the wind howling in behind him before he managed to heave the door shut again. The scene inside was one of desperate misery. Alara was huddled in the corner, her own thin shawl wrapped around her youngest son, Leo, who was shivering violently in her arms despite the heavy coat Silas had left them. The boy's face was flushed, his eyes glassy with fever. His cries had subsided into weak, whimpering moans. The other 2 boys were pressed against their mother, their faces pale with cold and fear. Alara looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and desperation. He's burning, she gasped. I can't get him warm. Silas didn't waste time with words. He strode over to them, his face grim. He knelt and placed a rough hand on Leo's forehead. The heat was alarming. He looked from the sick child to the inadequate shelter of the barn. There was no choice. He had to break his own most sacred rule. He had to let them in. He scooped the small, shivering boy, blankets and all, into his arms. Leo felt terrifyingly light. Silas looked at Alara. "Come," he said, his voice a low growl against the storm. "All of you. Now." She didn't question him. She gathered her other sons and followed him as he turned and battled his way back to the heavy door. He led them across the frozen yard, shielding the small child in his arms with his own body. They burst into the cabin, bringing the storm in with them. Silas kicked the door shut, plunging the bolt home. The roar of the wind was instantly muffled, reduced to a distant howl. The sudden warmth and quiet of the small room was a shock. The cabin was a single room, dominated by a large stone hearth where a fire blazed. A simple bed stood in one corner, a sturdy table and 2 chairs in the center. In another corner sat a small wooden rocking chair, its seat empty. It was sparse, but it was warm and safe. It was a sanctuary. Silas carried Leo straight to his own bed and laid him gently on the mattress. He piled extra blankets on top of the boy. He turned to Alara, who stood dripping and shivering by the door, her other 2 sons clinging to her. "Get them warm," he ordered, pointing to the fire. "Take off their wet things." He moved to the hearth, stoking the fire until it roared. He filled a kettle with water and hung it over the flames. Then he went to a small, dark wooden chest in the corner, a chest he had not opened in 5 years. He lifted the lid. The scent of dried herbs and memories filled the air. His wife had been skilled with herbs, her remedies a gentle magic. He rummaged through the small cloth sacks until he found what he was looking for: yarrow and elderflower, for fever. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he measured the herbs into a tin pot. Alara had removed the boys' wet jackets and boots and settled them on the rug before the fire. They stared at the flames, their eyes wide with awe and exhaustion. She watched Silas, her suspicion still a live thing inside her, warring with a desperate, overwhelming gratitude. He moved with a purpose she had not seen before, his silence no longer sullen but focused. He was a man who knew what to do in a crisis. He brewed the bitter tea, strained it into a tin cup, and brought it to the bed. "Help me," he said to her. It was not a request. Together they propped the boy up. Silas held the cup to Leo's lips, coaxing him to drink the warm, pungent liquid. Leo whimpered and tried to turn away, but they persisted, getting a few small swallows down his throat. Then there was nothing to do but wait. Wait for the herbs to do their work. Wait for the fever to break. Wait for the storm to pass. Silas pulled one of the chairs to the bedside. Alara stood on the other side, her hand never leaving her son's forehead. The other 2 boys fell asleep on the rug, lulled by the warmth of the fire. The only sounds in the cabin were the crackle of the logs, the relentless howl of the wind outside, and Leo's shallow, ragged breathing. The silence between the 2 adults was thick and heavy, filled with unspoken histories. Hours passed. The storm raged on. Silas got up only to add wood to the fire or to check on the sleeping boys. He felt exposed, vulnerable. This small, desperate family had breached his defenses completely. Their suffering was now inside his walls, in his bed, breathing his air. It was a torment. It was a penance. He found his gaze drifting to the empty rocking chair in the corner. It stood in the shadows, a silent monument to his loss. He could almost see his wife, Sarah, sitting there, her knitting in her lap, a soft smile on her face. He could almost hear the creak of the runners on the floorboards. "He had a fever, too," Silas said, his voice raw, as if he were tearing the words from his own throat. He didn't look at Alara. He kept his eyes fixed on the empty chair. "My boy, Daniel." Alara's head snapped up. She looked at him, her expression softening with a dawning, sorrowful understanding. She had seen the carved bird, the rocking horse, the profound emptiness of this place. Now she understood the reason for it. This was not just a lonely place. It was a haunted one. "A storm like this," Silas continued, the words coming easier now, a torrent breaking through a dam of grief, came on fast. The doctor was 10 miles away, across the river. The river was already flooding. I waited. I thought it would break. I thought I could handle it. He finally turned to look at her, his eyes hollowed out by a pain so deep it seemed bottomless. The fever didn't wait. By the time I knew, it was too late. For him. For his mother, he swallowed hard. She caught the sickness from him. They were gone within a week of each other. I buried them on the hill, just as the snows melted. He fell silent, the confession hanging in the warm air of the cabin. He had never spoken these words to another living soul. He had carried the guilt like a shroud, letting it smother him, believing it was what he deserved. Elara listened, her own grief a quiet echo of his. She knew loss. She knew the terrible weight of being the one left behind, the one who had to keep going. She reached across the bed and laid her hand gently on his forearm. It was a simple, instinctive gesture of shared humanity. His arm was rigid as stone beneath her touch, but he did not pull away. "It wasn't your fault," she whispered. The words were inadequate, but they were all she had. "I should have gone sooner," he said, his voice flat. "I should have tried." They sat in silence again, but it was a different kind of silence. It was no longer a wall between them, but a shared space, a vessel holding their collective sorrow. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of storm was beginning to quiet. Sometime before dawn, as the wind began to lose its edge, Silas felt the heat under his hand lessen. He looked at Elara. She felt it too. A faint sheen of sweat had broken out on Leo's forehead. The fever was breaking. He would be all right. Silas closed his eyes, a profound, shuddering relief washing over him, so potent it felt almost like pain. The storm passed as dawn broke, leaving behind a world transformed. The landscape was scoured clean, encased in a thin, glittering layer of ice. The sky was a pale, fragile blue. Inside the cabin, a fragile peace had settled as well. Leo slept soundly, his breathing deep and even. His brothers were still curled up on the rug by the hearth, which now held only glowing embers. The shared vigil had changed everything. The boundary between the cabin and the barn had dissolved. Elara and her sons did not return to the cold straw. Silas didn't suggest it. It was unspoken. They were here now. He moved his few belongings from his bed to a small cot he pulled from storage, giving the main bed to Elara and Leo. Caleb and Finn made their beds on the rug by the fire. The small cabin was crowded, filled with the quiet sounds of life, breathing, movement, the rustle of blankets. For Silas, it was both an agony and a strange comfort. A new routine emerged, one of shared space and tentative interaction. Elara took over the cooking, her presence transforming the hearth from a simple source of heat into the heart of a home. She made stews that filled the cabin with savory smells Silas hadn't experienced in years. She baked bread, its warm, yeasty scent a balm to his soul. In return, he worked tirelessly, ensuring they had everything they needed. He repaired the boys' worn-out boots, patched their thin coats. He taught Caleb how to split firewood, showing him how to read the grain of the wood, how to swing the axe with a clean, efficient motion. The boy was a quick study, his quiet admiration for the stoic man growing with each passing day. Words were still sparse between Silas and Elara, but they were no longer necessary. They communicated through 1,000 small gestures. The way he left a bucket of fresh water for her just inside the door each morning. The way she left a hot cup of coffee on the table for him when he came in from his chores. They moved around each other in the small space with a careful, respectful grace, two solitary planets slowly being drawn into a shared orbit. But the world outside the small ranch still existed. Their supplies began to run low. Flour, salt, coffee, things they couldn't grow or hunt. A trip to the town of Redemption was unavoidable. Silas dreaded it. He had avoided the town for years, going only when absolutely necessary, conducting his business quickly and returning to his isolation. The townsfolk knew his story or parts of it. They saw him as the grim recluse, the man broken by tragedy. Their pity felt like acid, To go into town with a woman and 3 children. It would cause talk. It would invite questions he had no intention of answering. He put it off for as long as he could, but the day came when the flour sack was empty. He hitched his 2 sturdy mules to the buckboard wagon. "We're going to town," he announced, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. Alara's face tightened. She had her own reasons to fear towns, to fear the judgment in the eyes of strangers. But she nodded, her chin held high. She dressed the boys in their cleanest, most mended clothes, scrubbing their faces and hands until they shone. They looked like a respectable family. She thought, if you didn't look too closely at the patches on their knees or the wear on her dress. The ride to redemption was silent and tense. The boys sat in the back of the wagon, uncharacteristically subdued. Alara sat on the bench beside Silas, her hands clenched in her lap. The town came into view, a dusty collection of wooden buildings huddled together as if for protection against the vast emptiness of the prairie. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store. As he helped Alara down, he felt the eyes of the town on them. People stopped on the boardwalk, their conversations faltering. They stared at Silas Blackwood, the hermit with a strange woman and 3 boys. The whispers started almost immediately, a rustle of curiosity and suspicion. Just as Alara's feet touched the ground, a man stepped out of the mercantile. He was well dressed in a dark suit, his face fleshy and smug. He stopped short when he saw her, a look of cruel amusement spreading across his features. "Well, Alara Vance," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone on the street to hear. "Look what the wind blew in. I heard you'd left the county." Alara flinched as if struck. She grabbed Finn and Leo, pulling them close. Caleb stepped forward, placing himself between his mother and the man, his small body a defiant shield. Silas recognized the man, Marcus Sterling, a land baron who had bought up half the county, known for his predatory business practices and his cold heart. "I see you found yourself a new situation," Sterling continued, his eyes sweeping over Silas with contempt before landing back on Alara. "Couldn't make it on your own with those boys? Could you? Always knew you were weak. Selling yourself for a roof over your head now? I wonder what your dear departed husband would think of that." The insult was a public branding, meant to humiliate, to strip away the last of her dignity. Alara's face went pale, but she did not speak. She simply held her sons tighter, absorbing the blow in silence. The onlookers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away, ashamed. Others watched with a kind of hungry satisfaction, eager for the drama. Silas had stood frozen, his old instinct to retreat, to remain invisible, warring with a new, unfamiliar protective rage. He saw the tremor in Alara's hands. He saw the fear and shame in her eyes. He saw the way Caleb stood ready to fight a man 3 times his size for his mother's honor. And in that moment, the last of his stone wall crumbled to dust. The ghosts of his past were no longer screaming accusations. They were urging him forward. "This time you will not wait. This time you will act." He took 2 slow steps forward, placing himself directly between Sterling and Alara. He was taller than Sterling, broader. His presence was a solid, physical fact. He didn't look at the other man. His gaze was fixed on Alara, his expression unreadable but for a strange softness in his eyes. The entire street seemed to hold its breath. "She's with me," Silas said. His voice was quiet, without anger, but it carried with absolute authority. It cut through the whispers and the tension. It was a simple statement of fact, a declaration. He then turned his head slightly, just enough to pin Sterling with a look of cold, hard promise. "You will show her respect." Sterling's smug expression faltered. He was not used to being challenged, especially not by the town recluse. He saw something in Silas's eyes that made him take an involuntary step back. It was not the look of a broken man. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose, and had therefore become unbreakable. Silas held his gaze for a long moment, then dismissed him completely. He turned back to Alara, his whole demeanor changing. He reached out and gently touched her elbow, his calloused thumb brushing against her sleeve. His voice, when he spoke again, was for her alone, though the whole town heard it. "You're home now," he said softly. It was more than a rebuttal to Sterling's cruelty. It was a promise. It was an anchor. It was the sound of a gate clicking shut, not to keep the world out, but to keep his family in. He guided her and the boys toward the store, his hand never leaving her arm, a silent, unmovable shield around them. The crowd parted before them, their whispers now tinged with awe and a newfound respect. Marcus Sterling was left standing alone in the dusty street, his venom rendered powerless by a quiet man's simple, profound act of redemption. The journey back from redemption was as quiet as the journey in, but the silence had transformed. It was no longer heavy with tension and apprehension. It was a comfortable, shared quiet, full of unspoken understanding. Alara sat tall on the wagon bench. The shame Sterling had tried to inflict upon her washed away by Silas's simple, powerful words. "You're home now," the phrase echoed in her mind. It was a word she had not allowed herself to think, let alone feel, for a very long time. Home had been a place she had lost, a memory that brought only pain. Now, sitting beside this quiet, complicated man, she felt the first stirrings of its possibility again. Silas kept his eyes on the road, but he was acutely aware of her beside him. He felt the warmth of her arm near his, a warmth that seemed to seep through his sleeve and into his very bones. He had not planned to say what he said. The words had come from a place deep inside him he thought had long since died. A place of loyalty, of protection, of belonging. In defending her honor, he had inadvertently declared his own intentions, to the town, to her, and most surprisingly, to himself. The recluse of Blackwood Ranch had claimed a family. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, he felt a strange, unfamiliar lightness in his chest. When they arrived back at the ranch, the air itself seemed different. The late afternoon sun slanted across the yard, casting long, peaceful shadows. The cabin no longer looked like a lonely outpost against the wilderness. It looked like a destination. It looked like a beginning. The next day, Silas did something he hadn't done in 5 years. He unbarred the door to the small second room of the cabin, a room that had been his son's. It had been left exactly as it was the day Daniel died, a perfect, heartbreaking shrine to a life cut short. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from the window. A small bed, a wooden chest, a shelf with a few worn books. Silas stood in the doorway for a long time, breathing in the stale air of his grief. Then, he took a deep breath and stepped inside. He opened the window, letting the fresh, clean air pour in. He began to clean. He stripped the old linens from the bed, took down the curtains, and wiped the dust from every surface. He did not do it with his usual grim efficiency, but with a kind of gentle reverence, as if he were tending to a sacred place. Alara found him there, a rag in his hand, staring at the faint pencil marks on the wall where he had once measured his son's height. She said nothing, simply picked up another rag and began to help him. The boys, seeing what was happening, joined in. Caleb, ever his mother's shadow, helped her wash the window until it sparkled. Finn and Leo, armed with small brooms, swept the floor with more enthusiasm than skill, raising a cloud of dust that made them sneeze and laugh. It was the first time Silas had heard them laugh freely inside the cabin. The sound did not hurt him as he thought it would. It was like rain on parched ground. They worked together all day, transforming the room from a tomb of memory into a place of life. They moved the boys' few belongings in. The blankets Silas had given them, the wooden horse Caleb had carved, a small, smooth stone Leo carried in his pocket for luck. It became their room. That night, for the first time, Silas looked at the empty rocking chair by the fire and saw not the ghost of his wife, but the image of Alara, sitting there, her hands busy with some mending, a quiet presence that filled the empty space not with sorrow, but with a gentle, calming peace. The house was breathing again. It was no longer just his shelter. It was their home. A season turned. The harsh, windswept plains softened into autumn. The cottonwoods along the creek bed turned a brilliant, shimmering gold. their leaves rustling in the gentler breeze. Life on the ranch settled into a new, comfortable rhythm, a quiet symphony of shared work and growing affection. The five of them moved as a unit now, their individual sorrows slowly weaving together into a tapestry of family. Silas took Caleb under his wing. The boy was a natural on the ranch, observant and eager to learn. Silas taught him how to read the clouds for signs of rain, how to track a deer, how to mend a harness with a sailor's stitch that would never break. He found a strange joy in passing on his knowledge, in seeing the boy's face light up with understanding. In teaching Caleb, Silas was healing a part of himself he thought was lost forever. He was becoming a father again. Alara, too, found her place. With Silas's help, she tilled a patch of earth near the cabin and planted a small kitchen garden. Carrots, onions, hardy greens. Her hands, which had been clenched in fear for so long, found a deep, abiding comfort in the feel of the soil. Tending the small green shoots was an act of faith, a belief in the future. She brought life back to the dormant land, just as she was bringing it back to the dormant heart of the man who had given them sanctuary. The younger boys, Finn and Leo, blossomed in the safety of the ranch. Their laughter, once a rare and hesitant sound, now echoed freely across the yard. They chased grasshoppers through the tall prairie grass, their fears forgotten. They would follow Silas as he did his chores, a pair of small, adoring shadows. Leo, the boy whose fever had broken the walls between them, was especially devoted. He would often just sit on the porch steps watching Silas work, his small face a study in absolute trust. One evening, Silas came in from the fields, weary from a long day of reinforcing the corral before the first snows. The cabin was warm and filled with the smell of roasting chicken. Alara was at the hearth, her face flushed from the heat. The boys were at the table, quietly drawing on a piece of butcher paper she had gotten for them in town. As Silas washed his hands in the basin, Leo came up to him and shyly tugged on his sleeve. "This is for you," he whispered, holding up a drawing. Silas dried his hands and took the paper. The drawing was crude, done in charcoal from the fire. It showed 5 stick figures standing in a line in front of a square house with a triangle roof and a curly plume of smoke coming from the chimney. There was a big figure on one end, then a slightly smaller one, and then 3 progressively smaller ones. The figures were all holding hands. Above them, the artist had drawn a giant, smiling sun. Silas stared at the drawing, his throat tightening. He looked at the tall stick figure on the end. Him. Then Alara. Then Caleb, Finn, and Leo. Family. Whole. He ran his calloused thumb over the smudged charcoal, his touch gentle, as if he were handling something infinitely precious. He looked up and met Alara's eyes across the room. She was watching him, a soft, knowing smile on her face. In that single, shared glance, everything was understood. No words were needed, no grand declarations. There was only this simple, profound truth, captured in a child's drawing. From the silence and the hardship, from the shared grief and the quiet acts of kindness, something resilient and beautiful had taken root. Love. It wasn't a fiery, passionate thing, but something quieter, deeper. It was the sturdy, steadfast love of 2 people who had weathered the worst of life's storms and found a safe harbor in each other. He carefully folded the drawing and tucked it into his shirt pocket, placing it over his heart. He sat down at the table with the boys, and as Alara brought the food over, he reached out and briefly squeezed her hand. A simple acknowledgement, a confirmation. The house was no longer just a shelter from the world. It was the center of his world. Winter arrived, blanketing the plains in a deep, silent layer of white. The world outside the cabin was stark and frozen, but inside, a steady warmth radiated from the stone hearth. The rhythm of their lives slowed, turning inward. The days were spent on indoor chores, mending tools, patching clothes, reading aloud from one of the few books Silas owned. The cabin, once a space of profound loneliness for one, was now a cozy, bustling haven for 5. The heavy sheepskin coat Silas had given Alara on the night of the storm now hung on a permanent hook by the door. It had become a communal object, a symbol of the protection he had offered and she had accepted. Sometimes, when coming in from the cold, one of the boys would bury their face in its thick, woolly collar, finding comfort in its familiar scent of leather, wood smoke, and Silas. It was no longer just his coat. It was the family's shield against the cold. The small wooden rocking chair, once an emblem of his grief, was no longer empty. More often than not, Elara sat in it in the evenings, the gentle creak of its runners on the floorboards a soothing, domestic sound. She would be mending a shirt or shelling peas into a bowl in her lap, her presence turning the chair from a monument of loss into a cradle of life. The ghosts had been gently eased out, replaced by the warmth of the living. One evening, a quiet contentment had settled over the cabin. A blizzard was blowing outside, but the wind's howl sounded less like a threat and more like a distant song. The boys were asleep in their room, their breathing soft and even. Elara was in the rocker, her hands finally still in her lap, her eyes half closed as she watched the hypnotic dance of the flames in the fireplace. Silas sat at the table, methodically cleaning a bridle, the familiar task a kind of meditation. The scent of leather oil and wood smoke mingled in the warm air. He finished his work, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked over at her. The firelight softened the lines of weariness on her face, illuminating the quiet strength that he had come to admire so much. She had survived so much, had fought so hard for her sons, and had arrived at his fence line with nothing but her dignity intact. And in saving her, he had, in turn, saved himself. She had brought him back to the world of the living. He rose from the table and walked over to the hearth. He didn't speak. He simply stood beside her chair for a moment, then reached down and laid his large, work-roughened hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the rocker. It was a gesture of immense tenderness, a culmination of all the unspoken words and quiet acts of the past months. It was a question and an answer, a vow and a comfort, all in one simple touch. Elara opened her eyes and looked up at him. She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers through his. Her touch was warm, sure. A current of deep, peaceful understanding passed between them. The long winter of their solitude was over. They had found their spring. She did not pull away. She stayed.